Lord, open our ears to hear your word. Open our mouths to sing your praise. Open our hearts to do your work in the world. Please be seated. God's extravagant hospitality. That is the theme of today's readings from Paul's letter to the church in Galatia and Luke's Gospel. God's extravagant hospitality. And that's a great theme for Father's Day. And we always read this story on Father's Day. But the reason I love this story and the other gospel stories of this dinner party is that they remind me of my grandmother, who would have been 110 on Tuesday. When I put a face on God, it is her face. I'm so grateful that I get to remember her through these readings this weekend each year. She was the most generous, loving, accepting, welcoming person I've known. She lived God's extravagant, generous, loving, accepting, welcoming hospitality. And Luke shows us about this in his story of a dinner party. Jesus and the other invited guests have come to the house of Simon the Pharisee for a meal and for the conversation that was part of the dinner custom. The guests, all men, were reclining on couches around a U-shaped table. And to help you envision that, imagine tables set up in an open U with couches radiating out from the table, and everybody lying on their left side, resting their head like this, eating with their right hand. As was also the custom, doors were left open so that passers-by could see the party and even come in to the house and sit along the wall as silent observers, watching and listening. This was long before television or iPhones or iPads. So the woman who came up behind Jesus and enacted her gratitude in an emotional and extensive way. She was not a party crasher. She had come in with a tacit invitation. But Simon, the host, is appalled. He recognizes this woman and knows that she is a sinner. And here she was, breaking cultural rules by approaching the honored guest in this way, and especially by unbinding her hair. Women never do this in public. So Simon criticized her, but what he failed to recognize is that he is a sinner too, as are we all. He also does not know that she knows herself to be forgiven, and that she is thanking Jesus for this. Her response to being forgiven is as extravagant as the forgiveness itself. With tears of joy, she washes Jesus' feet and unbonds her long hair to dry them. She has a valuable alabaster jar filled with scented oil, and with this she anoints Jesus' feet in a prayer of thank you, thank you, thank you. We know nothing about this unnamed woman, except that she is overcome with joy and gratitude and pours this out to Jesus. Simon thinks he knows her, thinks that she is a sinner, and that her behavior is shocking. In other words, Simon thinks he is better than this woman. So if you've been paying attention to Jesus, you know that he will probably do something to help Simon see the error of his thinking. So Jesus tells a parable to help Simon understand. But Simon's heart is still filled with his own importance, and he doesn't get the message. Like the rich young ruler in another gospel story, who can't accept that his material stuff is in the way of his relationship with God. Simon is filled with self-righteousness. He doesn't understand that this attitude of his is as much of a sin as anything he thinks about this woman. He doesn't see that God's extravagant grace is offered to everyone, and that includes us. He doesn't see that the woman's extravagant gratitude shows that she does understand and has experienced God's gift of grace. So the woman is euphoric as she lives into her forgiveness. Simon is still his hard-hearted, self-satisfied, and critical self. In the words of Jonathan Swift back in 1711, Simon has just enough religion to hate, but not enough to love. So the woman will go in peace, as Jesus invites her. Simon will not know such peace until he can accept God's grace for himself as well as for her. God's extravagant hospitality, opening the kingdom to all who open their hearts and become the new creation as Christ lives in us and through us. And Paul's letter to the church in Galatia also shows us God's extravagant hospitality. Paul writes that we are justified not by the works of law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. That enough is generous on God's part. But the reality is even better than that. Bible scholars now tell us that the way this really reads is not faith in Jesus, but through the faithfulness of Jesus. So, our salvation comes not by what we do, works of the law, or what we believe in, Jesus, but through what Jesus did for us. He was faithful to God. And I know you've heard me say it before, but I think that bears repeating. So God's extravagant hospitality invites us to the kingdom. God opens the kingdom with his grace. The only thing we have to do is accept the invitation and say, thank you. Can you imagine how life was now for this woman at Luke's parties? What life was like for her as a new creation, a child of God. The grace that fills her heart to overflowing will be with her forever. This grace and the joy it brings to us is not for the ever after, but for right now, today. I'm so grateful to my grandmother that she lived grace and helped me know what God offers us. God's gracious gift of salvation is for us right now, not to set aside until we die. As we live to follow Christ with our whole lives, we show that we accept God's extravagant gift. We live thankfully and joyfully in that grace. What keeps us from living in this gift? For some, it is self-righteousness, like Simon the Pharisee. He thought that he had made himself right with God, so he thought he didn't need grace. He trusted in himself, not in God. Others feel themselves unworthy of God's grace. They can't believe that God loves them, or that God's grace is offered to them. So they show that they don't trust God's promises. Jeff Krantz has written, because of this not trusting, there are deep cisterns in us filled with guilt that Jesus would turn to wine if only we could bring ourselves to hear and trust his word of forgiveness. And when we do, the woman's reaction no longer seems so peculiar. In fact, I can imagine many more extraordinary responses. Gregory Boyle's powerful book, Tattoos on the Heart, is filled with extraordinary responses to God's grace. I would love to read the whole book to you, but I'm just going to give you one story today. Maybe it will lead you to imagine other responses to God's grace that we could live here and now ourselves. Boyle is a Roman Catholic priest who lives and works with former gang members in Los Angeles. He writes of heart-wrenching deprivation and loveless lives of these young men and women. Gang life offers companionship and acceptance. That is true. But the price is violence, and often prison and death. So Boyle started Homeboy Industries to offer jobs and the first real acceptance and companionship these kids have experienced. Acceptance. Such a simple thing. God's hospitality. Boyle writes about Omar. He's 17 and in prison. And he talks with Boyle about the violence and the deaths. When's it going to end? He asks. It will end, Boyle says, the minute you decide. Boyle reaches out to shake Omar's hand as he's ready to leave. Omar's eyes fill with tears, and he grabs Boyle's hand in both of his and says, well then, I decide. Boyle tells him Omar has always been as simple as that. And he continues, Robert Frost writes, how many things have to happen to you before something occurs to you? Change awaits us. What is decisive is our deciding, he says. So Boyle's message is this, for Omar and for us. Jesus accepts you just as you are, and Jesus will change your life. God's extravagant hospitality. That is the message we hear from Luke and Paul today, and every time we let the Bible speak to us. God's extravagant hospitality. What will we decide to do about that? How will we let that speak to us? How will we